Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. As requested, I have some longer stories for you today. I have limited the imagery to get these 6 stories to you nice and quick. Enjoy. Story number 1. The Pet Store by the Curator. August 28, 2022. Dear Diary, my name is Emily, and I'm writing this in the hopes that someone, somewhere, can help me. I found myself in the midst of a nightmare that I never could have imagined, and I don't know what to do. It all started a few months ago, when my best friend Samantha suddenly disappeared. We had been inseparable since we were kids, and Samantha was the kind of person who was always there for me, no matter what. So when she stopped responding to my messages and calls, I immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. I frantically tried to reach her, going by her apartment and even filing a missing persons report with the police. But they didn't seem to take it seriously, telling me that Samantha was probably just on some kind of trip or had simply lost her phone. They assured me that she would turn up eventually, but I knew in my heart that this was not the case. Samantha was the most reliable and responsible person I knew. She would never just disappear without telling anyone, and the thought of her being in danger was eating me up inside. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started digging through Samantha's computer and social media accounts, desperate to find some kind of clue as to where she might have gone. That's when I stumbled upon something that would change the course of my life forever. Samantha had been conducting some sort of investigative reporting on the dark web, delving into the world of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. She had been getting dangerously close to exposing a ruthless criminal network that operated in the shadows of the internet. As I read through her research and notes, I felt a growing sense of dread and horror. The stories she had uncovered were truly the stuff of nightmares. Young women and girls being bought and sold as sex slaves, their lives reduced to a commodity. It looked like she had visited a website called the Pet Store, where these vulnerable individuals were listed and marketed like animals. The very thought of it made me sick to my stomach. I knew in that moment that Samantha's disappearance was somehow connected to her investigation. She must have uncovered something so damning, so horrific, that the people behind this operation decided to silence her. With a racing heart and a sense of determination, I decided that I had to see this website for myself. I had to find out if Samantha was being held there, and if there was any way I could help her. So I took a deep breath, fired up the Tor browser, and ventured into the darkest corners of the internet. September 12, 2022. Dear Diary, what I saw on that website has been seared into my mind, haunting my every waking moment. The things I witnessed were the most horrific and disturbing things I have ever encountered. As soon as I accessed the site, I was greeted with a series of categories: puppies, kittens, pussycats, and more. It didn't take long for me to realize that these were all euphemisms for young women and girls being sold as sex slaves. I hesitantly clicked on the pussycats category, and that's when I saw it. A picture of Samantha, wearing a skimpy bikini and looking terrified. The caption below read "New pet. Samantha, age 24. I felt like I was going to be sick. My best friend, the girl I had known since we were kids, was being sold on this horrific website. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand how this could be happening. I frantically searched the site, looking for any information that could help me find her. There was an option to purchase her, which made me want to vomit. I couldn't bring myself to click on it, but I did see that the site listed an address where the merchandise was kept. Without a second thought, I copied down the address and immediately called the police. I told them everything about Samantha's disappearance, her investigation into human trafficking, and the terrifying website I had discovered. They were understandably skeptical at first, but when I showed them the evidence, they realized the gravity of the situation. The police launched a full-scale investigation, enlisting the help of the cybercrime unit to trace the website and its owners. It was a painstaking process, but they were determined to find Samantha and take down this sick operation. In the meantime, I've been trying to cope with the trauma of what I've seen. The images of Samantha, scared and helpless, haunt me every time I close my eyes. I can't stop thinking about what she must be going through, and I pray that the police can find her in time. This whole experience has been the most horrific and disturbing thing I've ever gone through. I never imagined that something like this could be happening right under our noses. It's a harsh wake-up call to the dark and twisted world that exists on the internet. All I can do now is wait and hope that the authorities can put a stop to this nightmare. I'll keep you posted on any updates, but for now, I need to try and get some rest. The uncertainty and fear are becoming overwhelming. October 4, 2022. Dear Diary, it's been weeks since I reported the pet store website to the police, and I'm starting to lose hope. The cybercrime unit has been working tirelessly to try and track down the site's operators, but they've hit a wall. The website is being hosted on an anonymous server, and the owners are using advanced encryption and VPNs to cover their tracks. Meanwhile, the site is still active, and I've been receiving constant notifications about new pets being added. Each time I see a new post, my heart sinks, hoping and praying that it's not Samantha. But I know, deep down, she's still trapped there. The police have assured me that they're doing everything they can, but it's just not enough. These criminals are clearly several steps ahead of them, and they're running out of options. I'm terrified that time is running out for Samantha, and that the police won't be able to find her in time. I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't focus on anything but this nightmare. I feel like I'm going out of my mind with worry and guilt. If only I had pushed Samantha to stop her investigation sooner, maybe none of this would have happened. I've tried to contact the site owners directly, begging them to release Samantha, but they've ignored my messages. They must know that I'm onto them, and they're probably taking extra precautions to keep her hidden. I don't know what to do. I feel so powerless, so helpless in the face of this overwhelming evil. All I can do is wait and hope that the police can somehow break through and find Samantha before it's too late. I can't give up. I won't give up. Samantha is counting on me, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to bring her home. November 29, 2022. Dear Diary, just when I was starting to lose all hope, the police finally made a breakthrough. After months of tireless work, the cybercrime unit was able to trace the pet store website back to a warehouse in a remote area outside the city. With this new information, the authorities were able to obtain a search warrant and assemble a team to raid the location. I begged them to let me come along, to be there when they rescued Samantha, but they refused, saying it was too dangerous. So I waited, pacing back and forth, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I knew this could be the moment we'd been waiting for, the moment when Samantha would finally be free. The wait felt like an eternity, but eventually the police returned, their faces grim. I held my breath, waiting for them to deliver the news. And then they told me. Samantha was there, just as I had suspected, but she wasn't alone. The police had discovered a horrific human trafficking operation with dozens of young women and girls being held captive and sold as sex slaves. Samantha was alive, but barely. She had been beaten, starved, and subjected to unimaginable horrors. Trauma she had endured was written all over her face, and it broke my heart to see her in such a state. The police have taken her to the hospital, where she is now receiving medical treatment and counseling. They've also launched a full-scale investigation into the pet store website and the criminal network behind it. I'm relieved that Samantha has been found, but I'm also filled with a deep sense of rage and sorrow. How could this have happened? How could someone do this to another human being? I can't help but feel responsible, in a way. If only I had pushed Samantha to stop her investigation sooner, maybe none of this would have happened. The guilt is overwhelming, but I know I need to focus on supporting Samantha as she begins the long road to recovery. The police have assured me that they're doing everything in their power to bring the perpetrators to justice. They've already made several arrests, and they're confident that they can dismantle the entire operation. But for now, all I can do is be there for Samantha, to hold her hand and tell her that she's safe, that it's all going to be okay. It won't be easy, but I'll do whatever it takes to help her heal from this horrific ordeal. I just hope that, in the end, justice will be served, and that no one else will have to suffer the way Samantha has. Story number 2. I never thought I'd be telling this story. It's the most terrifying and disturbing thing that's ever happened to me, and the memory of it still haunts me to this day. I almost can't bring myself to write it all out, but I know I have to. Maybe sharing what happened will be cathartic in some way, or maybe it will just help warn others about the dangers that lurk in the darkest corners of the internet. Either way, I need to get this off my chest. I guess I should start by introducing myself. My name is Mark. I'm 24 years old, and I live in a fairly small city in the Midwest. For as long as I can remember, I've been hyperactive with crippling anxiety. As a result, I've relied on various prescription medications to help me function on a day-to-day basis. In the past couple of years, I've also started using opioid painkillers recreationally to help me relax and numb out when I'm feeling particularly anxious or overwhelmed. I know it's not healthy, but it's become a bit of a coping mechanism for me. To get these opioids, I started using the dark web. It was easy to find anonymous vendors who would ship me pills discreetly, no questions asked. I know it's incredibly risky and illegal, but the convenience and anonymity of it all made it hard to resist. I'd order my pills, they'd show up a few days later, and I'd be set for a while. This went on for quite some time without any major issues. One night, though, as I was browsing the dark web forums looking for my next opioid order, I came across a post that immediately caught my eye. The title simply read, "Happy Fun Time." Naturally, I had to click on it. What I found was a link to what appeared to be some kind of proxy site. When I followed the link, it took me to a page with a single video player, and not much else. There was no description, no title, nothing. Just the player. My curiosity got the better of me, so I hit play. At first, all I saw was a plain concrete room, dimly lit. But then, to my horror, a person came into frame, a man, bound to a chair with duct tape. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around the room. I immediately felt a sense of dread wash over me. What was this? Was I watching some kind of snuff film? Suddenly, another figure entered the frame. A large, imposing man wearing a mask that covered the lower half of his face. In his hand, he was holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. My heart started racing as I watched him approach the bound man. The man in the chair began to struggle and plead for his life, but the masked man simply grabbed his arm and proceeded to inject him with the contents of the syringe. The bound man let out a blood-curdling scream as the drug took effect. His body convulsed violently, and his face contorted in agony. I sat there in stunned silence, unable to look away from the horrific scene unfolding before me. After what felt like an eternity, the man in the mask stepped back, observing his handiwork. The bound man had gone limp, his breathing shallow and labored. The masked man then pulled out a small pocket knife and slowly, methodically, began to cut into the man's skin. I watched in horror as blood started to flow and the man in the chair moaned in pain. I wanted to look away, to shut my laptop and forget I ever saw any of this. But I couldn't. I was transfixed, my mind racing with a million questions. Who was this masked man? Who was his victim? What kind of sick, twisted place had I stumbled upon? As the torture continued, the masked man would occasionally stop to check on the man in the chair, making sure he was still conscious. At one point, he even leaned in close and whispered something to his victim, eliciting a fresh wave of terror and despair. I don't know how long this went on, but eventually, the masked man seemed to be done with his macabre session. He stepped back, wiping the blood from his knife, and then the feed suddenly cut to black. I sat there, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. What the hell had I just witnessed? I knew I should report this to the authorities, but a part of me was too terrified to do so. What if the masked man somehow found out? What if he came after me next? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something incredibly dangerous, something that was far beyond my ability to comprehend or handle. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I closed my laptop and tried to forget about it. I know. What a rookie, right? I went to bed that night, but I barely slept. The image of that bound, tortured man was seared into my brain, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. The next day, I tried to go about my business as usual, but I was on edge the whole time. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind constantly drifting back to that horrific video. As the days passed, my anxiety only grew. I kept checking the dark web forums, but there was no mention of the happy fun time site. It was as if it had never existed. I started to wonder if I had just imagined the whole thing, if it had all been some kind of twisted nightmare. But then, about a week later, I saw it. Another post, this time with a different title, Fun Time, Part 2. My stomach dropped, and I knew I had to see what it was. Against my better judgment, I clicked the link. This time, the video started with the same concrete room, but the bound man from the previous video was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a new victim was in the chair, a young woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s. She was sobbing, pleading for her life as the masked man approached her with the syringe. I watched in horror as the same scenario played out. The woman's screams of agony as the drug took effect, the masked man's methodical, clinical torture. It was all there, just like before. And just like before, the feed eventually cut to black, leaving me shaken and traumatized. At this point, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening. I had to do something. But what? I was just one person, completely out of my depth in this twisted, dark world. The thought of going to the police crossed my mind, but I was terrified of the consequences. What if they didn't believe me? What if the masked man found out and came after me? In the end, I decided to try and do some of my own research to see if I could uncover any information about this happy fun time site and the person behind it. I spent hours scouring the dark web, searching for clues, but it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Everything was anonymous, untraceable. Then, about a week after the second video, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Another post, this time with a simple title, Fun Time, Part 3. I hesitated for a long time before clicking the link, knowing full well what I was about to see. When the video started, I was greeted with the same concrete room, but this time, the bound victim was a man in his early 20s, someone who looked around my own age. He was struggling against his restraints, his eyes wide with terror. And then, the masked man appeared, holding that same syringe. As I watched the torture unfold, a sense of dread and helplessness washed over me. I knew I had to do something, but what? I was just one person, powerless against the evil that lurked in the shadows of the dark web. The torture went on for what felt like an eternity, the bound man's screams of agony echoing in my ears. And then, just as the masked man was about to deliver another dose of the drug, the feed suddenly cut out. The screen went black, and I was left staring at an empty video player, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It was all too much, the sheer brutality, the sense of helplessness, the knowledge that there were innocent people out there suffering at the hands of this twisted individual. Eventually, I forced myself to close the laptop and step away. I needed to clear my head, to try and figure out what to do next. Should I go to the police? But what if they didn't believe me? What if the masked man somehow found out and came after me? As I paced around my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the masked man was somehow aware of my existence and was coming for me next. The thought terrified me, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise. Man, this fucking anxiety. He's not coming for you, Mark. Just chill the fuck out. Days turned into weeks, and I still hadn't reported what I had seen. I was too afraid, too consumed by a sense of dread and helplessness. I spent my days in a constant state of anxiety, jumpier than ever before. And then, one night, as I was lying in bed, trying in vain to sleep, I heard a noise coming from my living room. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, listening intently. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate. Slowly, I reached for the baseball bat I kept by my bed, my hands trembling. I crept out of my bedroom, clutching the bat tightly, and peered into the living room. That's when I saw him, the masked man standing in the middle of my apartment, his dark eyes boring into me. I can't remember exactly what happened next. All I know is that I swung the bat with all my might, connecting with the masked man's shoulder. He grunted in pain and stumbled back, but he didn't go down. Instead, he lunged forward, his hands outstretched, and that's when I realized he was holding a syringe. I don't know how, but I managed to dodge his attack, swinging the bat again and again, desperately trying to keep him at bay. We struggled for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with the sound of our labored breathing and the dull thud of the bat against the masked man's body. And then, just as I was starting to feel myself losing strength, I saw an opening. I swung the bat with all my might, connecting with the side of the masked man's head. He crumpled to the floor, the syringe falling from his hand. I stood there, panting, my heart racing. I couldn't believe I had actually managed to fend him off. But the relief was short-lived, as I realized that I now had a decision to make. Do I call the police? Do I try to restrain him and interrogate him myself? In the end, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I quickly tied the masked man up, securing his hands and feet with duct tape. Then, I grabbed the syringe and examined it, trying to figure out what was in it. As I held the syringe, a wave of nausea washed over me. I recognized the clear liquid. It was the same drug the masked man had used on his victims. The thought of it made me shudder, and I knew I had to get it as far away from me as possible. I hurried to the kitchen and grabbed a large pot, filling it with water and bringing it to a boil. Then, I carefully dropped the syringe into the boiling water, watching as the liquid inside began to bubble and hiss. I stood there, transfixed, until the syringe had been completely destroyed. With that task done, I turned my attention back to the masked man, who was still lying on the floor, unconscious. I knew I had to call the police, but I was terrified of what might happen if I did. What if the masked man had accomplices? What if they came after me in retaliation? As I wrestled with my options, I suddenly remembered the video feeds I had seen. The thought of those innocent victims, tortured and tormented, filled me with a sense of rage and determination. I knew I had to do something, even if it meant putting myself at risk. So, I grabbed my laptop and started searching for the Happy Fun Time site, praying that it would still be active. To my horror, it was, and there was a new video feed already in progress. I watched in horror as the masked man's latest victim, a young woman, was bound to the chair, her terrified eyes darting around the room. I knew I had to act quickly, but I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. With a shaking hand, I dialed 911, explaining the situation in a frantic, jumbled voice. The operator tried to calm me down, assuring me that help was on the way. But as I waited, the torture on the screen before me continued, the woman's screams of agony tearing at my soul. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. I rushed to the door, ready to let them in and lead them to the basement, where the masked man lay unconscious. But as I opened the door, my heart sank. The street was empty, the sirens fading in the distance. I frantically scanned the area, but there was no sign of the police. Had they gotten lost? Had they decided not to come? In a panic, I turned back to the laptop, only to find that the video feed had gone dark. The torture had stopped, but I had no idea what had become of the young woman. Had the masked man somehow escaped? Was he coming for me next? I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. And then, the realization hit me. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone, in the clutches of a twisted, sadistic killer. And that's when I heard it, the soft, ominous sound of footsteps behind me. I knew, without a doubt, that it was him, the masked man, come to finish what he had started. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable, as the footsteps drew closer and closer. And then, everything went black. When I came to, I found myself in a dimly lit room, my wrists and ankles bound to a sturdy wooden chair. The masked man stood before me, his dark eyes boring into mine. "Welcome back," he said, his voice low and menacing. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. The man chuckled, then gestured to a small table beside me. On it, I saw the syringe, filled with the same clear liquid I had seen him use on his other victims. My heart began to race, and I started to struggle against my restraints. "There's no use fighting," the masked man said, his tone casual, almost bored. "You're only making it worse for yourself." He picked up the syringe and examined it, almost as if he were admiring it. "You know, I've been watching you for a while now, Mark. I've seen the way you've been struggling, the way you've been using those little pills to numb the pain. It's almost poetic, really." How did he know who I was? And why had he chosen me as his next victim? The masked man must have sensed my unease, because he let out a low chuckle. "Oh, don't worry, Mark. I'm not going to kill you. Not yet, at least." He leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "No, I have something much more interesting in mind for you." With that, he plunged the syringe into my arm, and the world began to spin. I cried out in pain and terror, but my voice was weak and barely audible. As the drug coursed through my veins, I felt a wave of nausea and disorientation wash over me. The masked man stepped back, watching me with a twisted sense of glee. "You see, Mark, I've been running this little operation of mine for quite some time now, and I found that the most effective way to get my victims to cooperate is to exploit their weaknesses, their desires." He paused, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "And you, my dear friend, are the perfect subject." I wanted to scream, to beg for my life, but the drug had rendered me helpless. All I could do was sit there, my mind racing as the masked man approached me once again, a sharp blade glinting in his hand. "Now, Mark, let's have some real fun together, shall we?" As the blade sliced into my skin, I let out an agonizing scream, the pain searing through every nerve in my body. The masked man continued his twisted work, cutting and slicing, pausing only to check on my vitals and ensure that I remained conscious. At some point, I must have blacked out from the sheer intensity of the pain. When I finally regained consciousness, I found myself alone in the dimly lit room, my body aching and my mind reeling. I glanced down at my wounds, wincing at the sight of the deep gashes and bruises that covered my skin. The masked man had been merciless, pushing me to the brink of agony. Yet, as I sat there, trapped and helpless, a glimmer of hope began to take root within me. Perhaps, in my delirium, I had missed an opportunity to escape. I strained against my bonds, searching for any give or weakness in the duct tape that bound my wrists and ankles. But no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free. Just as I was about to give in to despair, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. My heart raced as the masked man re-entered the room, a twisted grin plastered across his face. "Well, well, look who's finally decided to join us," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He approached me slowly, circling like a predator, toying with its prey. I tried to speak, to plead for my life, but my voice came out as a hoarse, raspy whisper. The masked man chuckled, clearly amused by my pathetic attempts to communicate. "Oh, don't worry, Mark. I haven't forgotten about you." He paused, tilting his head to the side, as if in deep thought. "In fact, I have something special planned for you." With that, he moved to the small table beside me, picking up the syringe that still held the remnants of the clear liquid he had used to incapacitate me earlier. My eyes went wide with fear as he approached, gripping the syringe tightly in his hand. "You see, Mark, I've been studying the effects of this particular drug, and I've found that it can be quite enlightening when used in the right way." He leaned in close, his masked face mere inches from mine. "And I think it's time we explore those effects a little further." Before I could react, he plunged the needle into my arm, slowly depressing the plunger. The familiar sensation of the drug coursing through my veins made my stomach lurch, and I tried to pull away, but it was no use. As the seconds ticked by, I could feel the effects taking hold. My body began to tremble, and a strange, tingling sensation spread throughout my limbs. The pain from my wounds seemed to intensify, yet at the same time, there was a strange, almost euphoric quality to it. The masked man watched me closely, his eyes glinting with a twisted fascination. "That's it, Mark," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "Just let it take hold. Open your mind to the possibilities." I wanted to scream, to curse him for what he was doing to me, but my throat felt like it was on fire, and no sound would come out. Instead, I could only sit there, helpless and terrified, as the drug worked its dark magic. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, and the world around me began to blur and distort. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more intense, and with each passing moment, the pain that had once been so overwhelming began to transform, becoming a strange, almost pleasurable sensation. The masked man observed me closely, taking notes and murmuring to himself. Occasionally, he would reach out and touch me, eliciting a shudder of both revulsion and what could only be described as a twisted form of ecstasy. As the minutes turned to hours, I found myself slipping deeper and deeper into a state of altered consciousness. The lines between reality and fantasy began to blur, and I found myself caught in a nightmarish yet strangely alluring world of the masked man's creation. At some point, I became vaguely aware of the video feed still running, broadcasting my torment to the dark corners of the internet. The thought of unknown, faceless individuals watching my suffering only added to the surreal horror of the situation, fueling the drug-induced hallucinations that threatened to consume me. I don't know how long this went on, but eventually, the masked man seemed satisfied with his experiments. He leaned back, removing his mask and revealing a face that, despite its twisted, sinister features, struck me as somehow familiar. "You know, Mark," he said, his voice low and contemplative, "I've been watching you for a long time. I've seen the way you've been struggling. I thought I might be able to help you. Isn't that what you want, Mark?" He paused, his brow furrowing in what almost seemed like genuine concern. "You and I, we're not so different, you know. We both have our demons, our vices, our ways of coping with the darkness that lurks within us." I wanted to protest, to insist that I was nothing like this twisted, sadistic individual. But the words caught in my throat, lost in the drug-induced haze that enveloped my mind. The masked man seemed to sense my inner turmoil, a wry smile spreading across his face. "Oh, don't worry, Mark. I'm not going to kill you. No, I have much bigger plans for you." With a sudden, fluid motion, he reached into his pocket and produced a small, rectangular object. My heart sank as I recognized it. A smartphone, no doubt rigged to stream the video feed of my torment. I wanted to scream, to beg for my life, but the drug had rendered me helpless, my mind and body under the masked man's complete control. As he began to set up the camera, I could feel a sense of dread and resignation wash over me. The masked man seemed to sense my despair because he leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "Don't worry, Mark," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "This is going to be the start of something truly special." With that, he pressed a button on the smartphone, and the video feed began to stream. I could see the familiar concrete room, the stark lighting casting long shadows across the space. And there, in the center, was me, battered, bruised, and utterly at the mercy of this sick freak. He was relentless, his every touch and every slice of the blade sending shockwaves of agony through my body. And all the while, the video feed continued to run, broadcasting my suffering to the world. I could only imagine the twisted individuals on the other end, watching with a morbid fascination as I was broken, physically and mentally. Time seemed to lose all meaning as the torture went on. The pain became a constant, all-encompassing force, and I found myself drifting in and out of consciousness, my mind desperately trying to escape the hell I had been thrust into. At some point, the masked man paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. He glanced down at the smartphone, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Well, well, it looks like our little show is getting quite the audience," he murmured. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes glinting with a twisted amusement. "You know, Mark, I have to hand it to you. You're proving to be much more resilient than I expected." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But don't worry, I've got plenty more where that came from." With that, he resumed his twisted work, and I found myself once again lost in a haze of agony and despair. The pain seemed to consume every fiber of my being, and I began to wonder if this was how it was all going to end. When I thought I couldn't take any more, something shifted. The pain, which had once been so overwhelming, began to transform into something else. A strange, almost euphoric sensation that coursed through my veins. I could feel the drug's effects intensifying, altering my perception of reality in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The world around me seemed to blur and distort, and I found myself caught in a web of hallucinatory visions and sensations. Sensing the change in my demeanor, paused his assault, his brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and curiosity. Well, look who's decided to join the party," he murmured, his voice dripping with a perverse fascination. He moved closer, his eyes locked on mine, and I could feel the intensity of his gaze boring into my very soul. "Tell me, Mark," he whispered, his breath hot on my face. "How does it feel? The pain, the fear, the ecstasy." I tried to speak, to protest, but the words caught in my throat, lost in a haze of sensations that threatened to overwhelm me. The masked man seemed to take my silence as an invitation, and he resumed his twisted ministrations, his every touch eliciting a strange, involuntary reaction from my body. The line between pleasure and pain blurring to the point of indistinction. The masked man's words echoed in my mind, taunting me with the realization that I was no longer in control, that I had become nothing more than a willing participant in his twisted game. The video feed, still running, broadcast my torment to the world, and I could only imagine the twisted individuals on the other end, watching with a morbid fascination as I was broken, physically and mentally, by this sadistic monster. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the masked man paused, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Well, Mar." With that, he turned his attention back to the smartphone, his fingers flying across the screen as he adjusted the camera and the video feed. I watched as the feed shifted, revealing a new angle, one that offered an even more intimate view of my torture. "There," he murmured. "That's much better. Now the whole world can see your transformation." I don't know how long this went on, but eventually, he seemed to grow weary of his twisted game. He stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and let out a long, satisfied sigh. "Well, Mark, I have to say, you've exceeded my expectations." He paused, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "But I'm afraid our little session has to come to an end. For now, at least." With that, he turned his attention back to the smartphone, his fingers flying across the screen. I watched, helpless, as the video feed went dark, the image fading to black. "Don't worry, Mark. I'll be back. And when I am, we're going to take our little game to a whole new level." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied me, as if trying to gauge my reaction. "After all, you and I, We're just getting started." With that, he turned and strode out of the room, the metal door crashing closed behind him, causing the bulb above me to flicker. I've accepted my fate. I know I'm not getting out of here. For now, I just need to keep my eyes open. Story number 3. I can't tell you my name, but I'm a cybersecurity specialist working for the federal government, tasked with monitoring suspicious online activity and rooting out any potential threats to national security. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills and puts food on the table for my wife and 2 kids. I had been in this line of work for nearly 15 years, and for the most part, it was fairly routine. Sure, we'd occasionally uncover some interesting stuff. Hackers trying to infiltrate government systems, online scams ripping off innocent people, that kind of thing. But nothing that really got the adrenaline pumping. That all changed one day when my boss called me into his office with a serious look on his face. He explained that they had been tracking a major sex trafficking operation on the dark web for years, and they were ready to finally take it down. But they needed someone with my specialized skill set to go undercover and gather the evidence they needed. At first, I was hesitant. I mean, this wasn't exactly my area of expertise. My job was more about defensive cybersecurity, not covert ops. But my boss insisted that I was the perfect man for the job. He said they would provide all the training and support I needed, and that if I was successful, there would be a big promotion and bonus in it for me. Honestly, the prospect of a promotion and bonus was tempting. My family had been struggling a bit financially, and the extra money would really help out. Plus, the chance to do something truly meaningful and take down a sex trafficking ring that was the kind of thing that could really make a difference. So after some serious consideration, I agreed to take on the assignment. Over the next few weeks, they got me all set up with a fake identity and background, as well as the latest hacking tools and software. They even put me through some self-defense training, just in case things got hairy during the operation. I have to admit, I was pretty nervous as I started diving into the dark web, searching for any signs of this elusive sex trafficking ring. But my training kicked in, and I was able to methodically work my way through the various layers of security, slowly gaining access to more and more of their network. It was when I finally managed to find a backdoor into their main website that things really started to get disturbing. What I discovered inside was absolutely sickening. Hundreds, if not thousands, of profiles of young women and girls who had clearly been kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery. There were detailed personal information, photos, and even live feeds showing what these poor victims were being forced to do. I felt nauseous just looking at it all, but I knew I had to keep going, to gather as much evidence as I could to bring these monsters down. So I started meticulously combing through the site, mapping out the structure of the organization, identifying the key players, and tracking the financial transactions. One thing that really stood out to me was how the site owners were accepting cryptocurrency as payment from their customers. I realized that if I could trace those crypto transactions, it might just lead me straight to the people behind this operation. So I dove even deeper, using my skills to trace wallet addresses and follow the money trail. It was slow, painstaking work, but after weeks of intense effort, I finally felt like I had enough evidence to take this thing down. I reported back to my boss, who was absolutely stunned by what I had uncovered. He immediately brought in the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to coordinate a massive takedown operation. The night it all went down was one I'll never forget. Armed federal agents stormed the location we had identified based on the information I had gathered. There was a huge firefight, but in the end, they were able to arrest the ringleaders and rescue dozens of victims. It was a huge victory, both for me personally and for the fight against human trafficking. But the story doesn't end there. In the weeks after the takedown, I started receiving some very disturbing threats. Apparently, the sex trafficking ring had some powerful connections, and they were not happy that I had taken them down. I started getting anonymous messages, phone calls, and even letters, all warning me to back off and keep my mouth shut. At first, I tried to ignore it. I figured it was just empty threats, people trying to scare me. But then, things started to escalate. My house was vandalized, my tires were slashed, and I even found a dead animal on my doorstep one morning. I was terrified, both for my own safety and for the safety of my family. I reported everything to the authorities, but they seemed unsure of how to handle it. They assured me they were investigating, but there didn't seem to be much progress. I started to feel like I was on my own, like I had become a target. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was at home with my wife, just trying to relax and unwind after a long day. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the front of the house. Before I could even react, two masked men came bursting through the door, wielding baseball bats. They immediately started swinging, yelling at me to keep my mouth shut. I tried to fight back, but they were much stronger and more aggressive. I took a few blows to the head and body before I finally managed to grab a baseball bat of my own and start swinging back. It was a brutal, chaotic fight. I was desperately trying to protect myself and my wife, but these guys were relentless. At one point, one of them broke free and started making his way towards my wife. I knew I had to do something, so I swung the bat as hard as I could, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, unmoving. The other intruder must have seen what happened, because he immediately turned and fled out the front door. I was shaking, both from the adrenaline and the realization of what I had just done. I had killed a man to protect my family. In the aftermath, the police were called, and the whole incident was investigated. Fortunately, they determined that it was a clear case of self-defense, and I was not charged with any crime. But the trauma of that night has stayed with me. I still can't believe this all happened. I was just a normal guy, doing my job, trying to make a difference. I never asked to be a target of some dangerous criminal organization, but now my life has been turned upside down. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified that they'll come after me and my family again. The authorities were eventually able to trace the attackers back to the sex trafficking ring I had taken down. Apparently, they had put a hit out on me, wanting to silence me before I could testify or reveal any more of their dirty secrets. It's all so surreal, like something out of a movie. I'm just grateful that I was able to protect my wife that night. But the guilt of having to take a life, even in self-defense, is something I'll have to live with forever. I hope that by sharing my story, I can warn others about the very real dangers that exist in the dark corners of the internet. Be careful out there. You never know who might be watching. In the weeks and months that followed, I became even more paranoid and on edge. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise. My boss tried to get me to take some time off, but I refused. The threats continued too. More messages, more vandalism, more signs that these people were still after me. The police did their best to investigate, but there was only so much they could do. These were clearly highly organized and resourceful criminals, with connections that went who knows how high up. I started taking extreme measures to try and protect myself and my family. I installed high-tech security systems, got a concealed carry permit, and even started taking self-defense classes. I was determined not to be caught off guard again. But no matter what I did, the sense of dread and fear never went away. I was always on edge, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then one day, it did. I was just sitting at my desk, working on some routine cybersecurity tasks, when my phone started ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer it. And when I did, my blood ran cold. It was one of the leaders of the sex trafficking ring. He was calling to taunt me, to let me know that they had found my family and that they were going to pay for what I had done. He gave me an address and told me to come alone or else. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I try to go rescue my family myself? I couldn't think straight. All I could imagine was my wife and kids being hurt or worse. In the end, I decided I had no choice. I had to go. I had to try and save them. So I grabbed my gun and my keys and raced to the address the man had given me. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the perfect secluded spot for some nefarious activity. As I approached the building, my heart was pounding. I could see that the doors were slightly ajar, so I quietly made my way inside. The place was dark and eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of muffled cries in the distance. I crept further in, my gun drawn and my senses on high alert. And then, finally, I saw them. My wife and kids, tied up and gagged in the corner of the room. My heart leapt with relief, but it was quickly replaced by pure, unadulterated rage when I saw the two masked men standing over them. Laughing, without a moment's hesitation, I opened fire. I don't know how many shots I fired. I was just consumed by this overwhelming need to protect my family, to make these bastards pay. When the smoke cleared, both men were lying on the ground, motionless. I rushed over to my family, untying them and checking to make sure they were okay. They were shaken, but thankfully unharmed. As we made our way out of that hellish place, I knew that our lives would never be the same. I've had to undergo extensive therapy to try and come to terms with what happened, with taking those men's lives to protect my own. And the guilt and paranoia have never fully gone away. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified that someone else from the trafficking ring will come after me and my family. The authorities were eventually able to trace the entire operation back to a network of high-powered individuals, including some politicians and business leaders. It was a massive, far-reaching conspiracy, and taking it down has become a top priority for enforcement. As for me, I've had to make some major changes in my life. I had to quit my job at the cybersecurity office, as the risk was just too great. I've gone into hiding with my family, constantly on the move to avoid being found. It's been an incredibly difficult and lonely existence, but I know that it's the only way to keep them safe. I hope that by sharing my story, I can warn others about the very real dangers that exist on the dark web. Be careful out there. You never know who might be watching. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, don't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect the ones you love. Because in the end, that's all that really matters. Story number 4. Daddy, the Puppet Master, by the Curator. I'll never forget the day I stumbled upon that twisted website. It was just supposed to be a typical Friday night video call with my old college buddies. We try to catch up every week, swap stories, and keep each other company even though we're all living in different cities now. This particular Friday, my friend Jared seemed deeply unsettled during our call. His brow was furrowed, and he kept fidgeting nervously, his eyes darting away from the camera. "Dude, what's going on?" I asked, concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jared hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. I found this website the other day. Something I saw on there has been mind-fucking me ever since. I leaned in. My curiosity piqued. What kind of website? What did you see? Jared shook his head slowly, a shiver running through him. I can't even describe it, man. It's the most fucked up thing I've ever witnessed. You've got to see it for yourself to believe it. A chill ran down my spine at his words. Jared was usually the life of the party, the one who was always cracking jokes and keeping us entertained. To see him this shaken, this disturbed, was deeply unsettling. Jared, what are you talking about? I pressed. What did you find? With a trembling hand, Jared reached for his keyboard and typed something into the chat. A link appeared, and he looked at me with a haunted expression. I really wish I could unsee what I saw on that site, he murmured. But now, it's etched into my brain forever. You've got to check it out, dude. Just be prepared for something truly horrific. I stared at the link, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to close the window and forget about it, to just pretend Jared had never shown it to me. But morbid curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked the link. The website that loaded was unassuming enough, just a plain black page with white text. The title at the top read Daddy, the Puppet Master. A countdown timer was ticking down from 5 minutes. As I watched the seconds slowly tick away, a sense of dread began to build within me. What kind of twisted, sick thing was I about to witness? I glanced at Jared, who was watching me with a look of pure terror. Jared, what is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. I can't tell you. You've got to see it for yourself. But I'm warning you, man. It's going to haunt you forever. The countdown reached 0, and the page suddenly refreshed. A video feed appeared in the center of the screen, the image grainy and shaky. I felt my breath catch in my throat as a large, rotund figure in a pig mask came into view. Welcome, welcome, my dear audience, the man in the mask said, his voice high-pitched and sing-song. Are you ready for the main event? He leaned back, revealing 2 small figures chained to the wall behind him. My stomach lurched as I realized they were young women, their limbs removed, leaving only bloody stumps. They were trembling in terror, their faces contorted in pain. The man in the mask reached out and grabbed one of the girls by the chin, forcing her mouth open. Now, my dear, tell the nice people what a naughty girl you've been, he said, moving her mouth as if she were a puppet. The girl's words were slurred and strangled. Please, help us. I felt bile rise in my throat as I watched the horrific scene unfold. I wanted to look away, to close the window and pretend I had never seen it. But I was paralyzed, my eyes glued to the screen. The man in the mask let out a gleeful cackle. Ah, but you see, my pet, no one is coming to save you. You're mine now, forever. He turned to the camera, his beady eyes glinting behind the mask. Who's next? Which one of you filthy little worms wants to be my new plaything? I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen in stunned silence. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a minute or 2. Finally, I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Those poor girls. What kind of sick, twisted individual could do something like that? I knew I had to do something, but what? Should I call the police? Would they even believe me? The site was on the dark web, after all. It wasn't exactly easy to trace. In the end, I decided the best thing I could do was to seek professional help. I couldn't shake the haunting images of those girls, their desperate cries for help echoing in my mind. I needed to find a way to cope with the trauma of what I had seen. I made an appointment with a therapist the very next day, and I've been working with them ever since. It's been a long and difficult process, but slowly, I'm learning to live with the memory of that twisted puppet show. I still can't erase the images from my mind, and I know I'll be grappling with the aftermath of that experience for a long time. But I'm determined to channel my anger and grief into positive action, to use my experience to raise awareness and support important causes. So, if you ever find yourself stumbling upon something as disturbing and horrific as that Puppet Master website, I urge you to seek help. Don't try to handle it on your own. The consequences can be truly devastating. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time.